Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Rosa Balfour. I'm the Director of Carnegie Europe, based in Brussels. And today I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to be hosting this discussion looking at the future of relations between Europe and Africa. And I'm in very good company today with Dr. John Nkengasong, who is the Director for the Africa Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, who has a long international career in public health, so we can start talking about the situation, the coronavirus situation in Africa. I am then joined by Dr. Zainab Usman, who is, I'm delighted to say, a new colleague of ours at the Carnegie Endowment, and she is leading a brand new program, Africa program, that we have just, that we are in the process of setting up. And finally, last but not least, Sandra Cramer, who is the works in the European Commission and is the Director for Relations with the Africa Union. Previously, she was in the cabinet of the former President of the European Commission and is working on this new partnership between the EU and Africa. And we hope to hear some further ideas about, what European thinking on how to restart this relationship. Let us start by taking a quick snapshot of the pandemic situation in Africa. 1 year ago, predictions were pretty gloomy as to how the coronavirus pandemic would unfold in Africa. Reality has been kinder to Africa. But please, tell us about the state of the pandemic and also of the vaccine rollout. John, over to you.
So thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to contribute to this very important conversation. And I'm also grateful for your efforts in pronouncing my last name, which many people are scared to death when they see it. I pronounce it so well, so I'm grateful for that. The situation in Africa, as you rightly said, was predicted to be worse than it is now. I always maintain that it was an issue of a delayed pandemic, and when we read the numbers that we all know, like 4.1 million people infected with about 110,000 deaths, we should put that in the context of underreporting. That there are two things I really want to say, distinguish here. One is that the number of infections, our estimate and projection is that many people have been infected in Africa. Recent data from Nigeria, especially from Lagos, showing that about 23% of the people in Lagos have been exposed to COVID-19. And if you imagine that Lagos is a city of about 20 million, will tell you that the numbers that we are projecting are reporting underestimates. Having said that, the fatality of the deaths on the continent due to COVID is not what it was projected to be. I mean, that is for sure. The first wave was characterized as relatively mild compared to other parts of the world. The second wave, a lot worse than the first, and we are moving towards the third wave, very clearly. And I would just conclude by saying that during the second wave, at least there's someone who knows of somebody who has died of COVID in Africa now, which was not the case during the first wave. I think that is telling. I personally now know of several people who have died, and I could have worked very hard to find anyone who has died of COVID during the first wave, which lasted up to around October last year. So I think we are seeing COVID in Africa that is progressing in a way that if we are not careful, it can become endemic. And the only way to avoid that catastrophic outcome, which is endemicity of COVID in Africa, is through vaccination. And we have to vaccinate at scale and vaccinate urgently, and what are characterized as the fierce urgency of now, if we want to avoid that devastating outcome. And if we have that, we go to that scenario, which is endemicity of COVID in Africa, then it will be a threat very clearly, not only to Africa, but to Europe, because you are our immediate neighbors, and we share a lot, very historic, long friendship, relationship, strong mixing. Always remember that all of our infections with very rare inception came from Europe. And that was because of the shared friendship that we have with Europe. And I think that it should always be remembered. We thought initially that it was going to come from China, but with the exception of Egypt, all infections came from Europe. So it means that we have to tighten that relationship between Europe and Africa to get this out of our continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, also for underlining the interdependence between Europe and Africa. May I just ask you about the vaccine rollout? How's it going in Africa? In Europe, it's not going very well.
There are two things. We have a simple formula that we use at Africa CDC, which says vaccines plus vaccinations equals life safe. So your situation is different. Your situation is that you have the vaccines, but the vaccination is challenged. So it becomes an issue to get to that equal sign, which is save lives. We don't have the vaccines. We can easily vaccinate if we have the vaccines. So we also end up with the same situation, which is not life safe. So the equation is common. You can apply that anywhere, but I think the different variables in the equation are very different. So for example, Ethiopia was able to vaccinate 12 million children of measles vaccines during this pandemic. So it suggests to you that if we have the vaccines, the vaccination piece can go very quickly and will save lives in Africa. I think that is so our greatest challenge now is to have access to vaccines. And the first wave of COVAX vaccine distribution occurred about 3 weeks ago. Now we are challenged that we are hearing very ugly signals from India that they will put a stop to export of vaccines. So that put us in a very terrible situation. We are hearing threats from Europe that they don't want to export, they may not be exporting vaccines. So I think that is the challenge we face as a continent, is access to vaccines, and in a timely fashion.
Thank you very much. And I hope we can talk about access to vaccines also later. But I'd like to turn to Zainab now. Zainab, you're a political economist. How is the continent responding from that point of view, from the political, the economic and social point of view? What are the implications?
Yeah, so again, it's really a pleasure to be on this panel to discuss this very, very important issue right now, because, you think about the economic situation of African countries, their socio-political situation, so much hinges on, effectively combating this virus. So in terms of the economic impacts, I think I'm going to divide that in two. There are immediate impacts, as we've already seen, and then there are the medium to long-term implications. In terms of the immediate impacts, the disruptive nature of the pandemic is, I think, aptly captured by a description by Ghana's finance minister that Africa could experience a lost development decade. And this is because last year, 2020, the region's economy contracted by around 2.6%, according to the IMF, due to a disruption of supply chains, reduction of exports, reduction of tourism and hospitality activities, and very, very importantly, due to impacts on small businesses, many of which operate in the large informal sector. They were affected by lockdowns and restrictions. But having said that, these impacts varied among different categories of countries. So among oil exporters like Angola, like Nigeria, like Gabon, they suffered from a decline in oil prices, which affected export earnings, but also government revenues. Although oil prices have now increased at around $65 a barrel. And Africa's largest economies in particular, bore the brunt of this. So Nigeria and South Africa all went into recession, although they are now crawling out of it. And in the case of Nigeria in particular, figures released a couple of days ago by the National Bureau of Statistics show that unemployment has increased to the extent that Nigeria has the second highest unemployment rate in the world at 33%, staggering 33%. And for youth unemployment in particular it is at around, it's over 40%. So this is really a dire situation. Even for economies that are less reliant on oil exports, on mineral exports, such as Cote d'Ivoire, but also the economies in East Africa, like Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, they have also seen a slowdown, but not necessarily a reversal of their strong economic trajectories. But then we've also seen that tourism-dependent economies in particular have been severely hit. So economies in Southern Africa, but also the small island nations of Mauritius and Seychelles. So overall, the IMF projects an aggregate growth of around 3.2% in 2021. So there's gonna be some recovery, but this is Africa just barely kind of emerging out of a recession, which is the worst it has experienced in the past 50 years. So that's in terms of the immediate impacts. In terms of the medium and long-term implications, I think there are probably three key things I want to mention here. The first is, the prospects of rising poverty. And according to projections by the World Bank and also the African Development Bank, up to 39 million people could fall into extreme poverty. This is despite the gains that have been recorded in the last 2 decades in many African economies that have done a fairly decent job of pulling people out of poverty. And then there's also a fiscal and liquidity crisis because, as I mentioned earlier, export earnings have been affected. So government revenue sources have declined and dried up, while spending, especially, with additional expenditure items on containing and mitigating COVID-19 itself, spending has increased. So the African Development Bank estimates that African countries need financing just for the year 2021 to the tune of $154 billion. Now that sounds like a lot, but then when you compare this with the stimulus packages we've seen in the United States, for instance, the third stimulus package passed just a couple of days ago to the tune of $1.9 trillion, that pales in comparison. And also in the EU, last year, a stimulus package of 540 billion euros was passed. And then a third medium to long-term implication is debt distress, not necessarily a debt crisis, but debt distress, because many African countries are using the scarce resources that they have available to also service debt. About 40% of this debt is increasingly owed to private creditors. So this means that a number of initiatives that have been set up to help suspend or manage debt may not necessarily apply to them. So like the World Bank's debt service suspension initiative, many countries have been quite reluctant to sign up to that because they are indebted to multilateral creditors. So countries like Kenya, like Ghana and Zambia. And then a few countries like Angola stand out because they are heavily indebted to countries like China. So, with this situation, you can see that African countries which have done a fairly good job in using limited resources to contain and mitigate the impacts of the virus, the pandemic itself, are now going to bear the economic brunt. So I'm gonna hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Zainab. Sandra, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, the EU made early announcements that it wanted to fight the pandemic in cooperation with others and not on its own. Of course, in moments of political crisis, this good intention is not always translated into facts. But what has the EU done so far for Africa and to support Africa fighting the pandemic?
Thanks, Rosa, and thank you for inviting me. And Zainab, congratulations on the program. I think it's excellent, and I congratulate Carnegie for that. I think that there was an immediate response when the pandemic broke out more than a year ago. The EU institutions, also member states agencies, financing agencies, all gathered together, and we all looked at how we could have a reallocation of various sources of funding towards the crisis, both to fight the health side of it, but also to fight the socio-economic side of it. And that is what we called the Team Europe Global Response, because we don't do this alone as EU institutions. We do this together with member states of the European Union. And that Team Europe Global Response for Africa meant that we had more than 8 billion available for governments to help, exactly as Zainab said, in their fiscal crunch. Very difficult times for governments. So through lots of budget support, for example, we helped them in the early stages of the crisis. And that Team Europe Global Response was very, geared towards vulnerable populations. Of course, you will remember maybe that we had some air bridges, which we took into some of our African countries. We started building, which we already did, but even further and quicker on strengthening health systems, and also propping up social safety nets, social protection projects. But now we have a very different phase of all this, because we have the vaccines not in enough supply and quantity, but they are there. And now the European Union is one of the leading contributors to COVAX. We, as a European Union budget, the EU institutions have 1 billion grant into that. But if you take Team Europe together, we have a 2.2 billion contribution into COVAX. So that's 2.2 billion euros. And that is a multilateral approach to make sure that vaccines reach our partners in lower and middle income countries. And already 20 countries in Africa have received vaccines because of COVAX, where the EU is a lead contributor. And just last week, when the EU leaders met, they confirmed again their commitment to strengthen the global response to the pandemic. And they look in particular, on top of what we do in the framework of COVAX, to a vaccine sharing mechanism. And that is now being discussed. We need early access to vaccines. It's exactly as John just said. We need them rapidly. Because the whole thing is that nobody's safe until everybody is safe. So this is really the underlying reason. And therefore, the vaccine sharing mechanism had a boost given to it by the EU leaders. And then, of course, we work with many organizations, also with the Africa Center for Disease Control. We just had at the G7 in February, President von der Leyen announcing 100 million in humanitarian assistance, of which we're currently discussing with the ACDC and also with partners like UNICEF, like WHO, like the Red Cross, on how to help, how to build capacity, how to support the vaccination campaigns. So in short, there is a lot that is being done. There is a deliberate choice to go via COVAX. But I must say the needs are, of course, very big, and it's never enough. We can deliver vaccines, which we've done through COVAX, but it is, of course, a huge, huge challenge. And I completely agree with John. We need to do more and step it up. But the European Union is doing what it can, as I said, with a huge contribution to COVAX. That's where I want to leave it for now, Rosa.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start looking forward and think about the implications of this for the relationship between the EU and Africa. Let me first ask a question, because we have most of the experts say, the pandemic was to be expected. What we didn't know was the when. So I think at this point, following this year, this rather shocking year, we can expect health infrastructure to be, and disaster preparedness with respect to pandemics, to be, quite high on the list of priorities. So I'd like to turn to John and ask you how you're approaching this with the Centre for Prevention that you're leading, and also through the African Union. I mean, how are you building health? How are you planning to build health infrastructure in Africa?
So, no, thank you, Rosa. And let me, before I answer that, go back to what Sandra just said about the European contribution, which I neglected to acknowledge early on. I mean, about the 100 million euro that was a promise, and we are working with the European delegation here very actively to address the second part of the equation, which is the vaccination part. And I think those conversations are going well. That's exactly the kind of partnerships that are required to, if we have a chance of fighting and winning back this battle. So back to your question about, I mean, we have a common thinking here, which I'm sure is aligning with your own thinking, that we need to step back as a people and say, have we taken the pandemic preparedness seriously? I think my answer is right up to this point, no. We talk more about it than we actually have invested in doing that. If you see the billions that have gone into, and trillions, sorry, that have gone into either the economic stimulus packages or the response, I imagine that even 5 years ago, after the Ebola warning shot in West Africa, that there was something potentially bigger to come in future. If we had invested just a fraction of that in strengthening our own health systems, and what the President Adesina of the African Development likes to call our health defenses, we would be at a much better position than we were 5 years ago. After the Ebola crisis in West Africa, I think all you need to do is to Google the reports from that, the lessons learned and the reports from the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and you see beautiful reports. They are all published in very nice journals like the New England Journal, the Lancet. The World Bank had this report, the Harvard had a report, the London School had a report. So you don't need to write any report for the COVID-19. 1 year later, all you need to do is to take one of those reports, the Word version, do a find and research and replace COVID with Ebola, and you get a report already that tells you exactly what we need to do. The question is translating what we know, what are called the known do-nothing gaps, into action. We know what the gaps are. We know that we need human workforce development. It's nothing magical. I mean, let this be. I've spent 32 years in the public health, and it's the same things. That okay, they have about 4 of them. One is that we need to strengthen our workforce capital. Okay, for public health, we as a continent, we left the Ebola outbreak in West Africa knowing that we needed about 6,000 epidemiologists. Today, we have 1,800 on a continent of 1.2 billion. So the gaps are known. We know that we need at least 25,000 frontline workers that can actually swing into action and fight this pandemic. We have 5,000 on the continent, so that is 20,000 right there. We left West Africa knowing that we don't have diagnostic capacity and the manufacturing for vaccines. Well, 5 years or 6 years after, we still don't have those things in place. We left the country knowing that they needed a regional body like Africa CDC. Africa CDC was born out of the crisis in West Africa. So that is a big tick right there. That is a gap that we knew that we needed as a continent, and then we established it, and the head of states are using it now to fight the pandemic. So that is a very good. So there are things that we know that we've neglected. I mean, and I use the word neglected purposefully because, I mean, we knew that these things are required. The reports were written but never acted on. It looks like there's something that deals with that has to do with the way we reason as human beings, that once the threat is out of our way, we go back to our what are called the status quo, which is where we hope nothing bad will happen, then something happens, and then we start scrambling there. So that mindset needs to change. The mindset of we respond, we react to it. I'll give you one example and I'll stop there. Each time there's an outbreak of Ebola in DRC, we go in there and you spend at least 1 billion, okay, to fight it. So there's a call for donors to come in and you contribute. The WHO, UNICEF, the World Bank release a lot of money. We go in, tackle that, squash it, we go out. Then after a few months, we go back again. But I really wish that we could have just, in that scenario in DRC, say we are going to devote $500 million to build a National Public Health Institute, equip it, and then they can do surveillance of Ebola so that each time it emerges, you allow the Congolese to respond to that. That is the kind of thinking that we should be having, not reacting to it and then go back and come back into that scenario, that theater of response. I think we need to work on that urgently. So I'll conclude by saying we need a new public health order for Africa that is better, bolder, and bigger, so that we can respond to health challenges.
Thank you very much. And before I turn to Zainab, let me just remind the audience that you can ask questions or make comments in the live chat through YouTube, and I can read the questions and relay them to our speakers. So please take advantage of this opportunity. And Zainab, I'd like to ask you also the same question, but more with a focus on politics and economics. You mentioned poverty, you mentioned the debt crisis. How should, the mantra now is build back better. It's been used in Europe, it's been used in the US. How should Africa build back better?
Yeah, so I think Dr. John Nkengasong has really laid out more or less what needs to be done, right? That there needs to be a new public health order in Africa or for Africa. And a lot of that has to be driven and underpinned by African countries themselves, African governments really making a decision to take public health seriously and to devote resources to building long-term capacity, right? Investing in upstream research and development for pharmaceuticals, treating also the health sector as, first of all, the services provided as a public good, but also the sector itself to treat it as an economic sector that can be linked to the rest of the economy. A strong and thriving pharmaceutical sector can create jobs, can be the linchpin for the diffusion of technology across the rest of the economy. So having a complete mental shift around that, and also realizing that, as much as development assistance, foreign aid can help, that should not be the main, that should not be the main funding source for the health sector or for public health in any country. So that's number one, and I think Dr. John has covered that adequately. I think a second aspect of this is, in addition to what African countries need to do, that in a once-in-a-century pandemic that threatens the bulk of humanity overall, we definitely need new approaches. We need mental shifts. We need paradigm shifts, and we need global coordination. Unfortunately, we seem to be heading towards a global environment of geopolitical competition. But there are certain things, certain areas where, as we've seen with this pandemic, and also on a different note, climate change, we need global coordination because these are threats that threaten humanity. And in the case of the COVID-19 and the whole discussion around vaccines, the well-being of humanity should precede the profit motive of private companies. This to be clear, the profit motive we know is what incentivizes innovation, the type that led to the creation of vaccines in record time last year. And this is not to dismiss that, but we need global coordination. We need to put human lives above some of these things at this critical period. So what that means is that we need to repurpose global bodies like the World Trade Organization, like the United Nations, which surely should be able to rally all countries around the common objective of saving humanity from this common threat. And already we are aware of the discussions underway. They're becoming really, really heated, really intense at the World Trade Organization around relaxing intellectual property protections for COVID-19 technologies that will allow the scale up of production across different parts of the world. And already some of that is starting to bear some fruit, but more needs to be done. And another area where we need this global coordination is in terms of addressing this fiscal and liquidity crisis that I mentioned in many developing countries, particularly those in Africa. Discussions again are underway at the International Monetary Fund on the issuance of new special drawing rights to the tune of 650 billion, which can be converted to hard currencies for immediate use in these countries. But the problem is, even when these special drawing rights are issued, African countries collectively will only get about 33 billion SDRs. So therefore, there needs to be coordination among the major economies to agree to reallocate these SDRs to the poorest countries. And by reallocating the SDRs, they're not removing money or funding from their own economies, because these are SDRs that will be created newly so that we can help the poorest in need. Because clearly we can see that if certain countries are left behind in terms of vaccinations, in terms of addressing the pandemic and addressing coronavirus itself, then nobody is safe, right? And then the final point that I'm going to make is that and Sandra mentioned, the COVAX initiative as one way in which is providing support to Africa and to other parts of the developing world. And COVAX is great; it's a great multilateral initiative, but it's just insufficient. At best, vaccine supplies through COVAX will cover only 20% of the population of any country. There's still a massive shortfall of another 40 to 60%, depending on how a country defines, vaccine coverage to achieve herd immunity. So, I feel like in a way, the whole discussion and the reliance on COVAX is a metaphor or is indicative of the current challenges of the current aid system itself. And some would go as far as saying that the aid system is broken, but I would not go that far. But I think there's a fundamental challenge there if, the wealthiest countries can only provide support by providing more money to COVAX, when what a lot of countries need right now is actually the vaccines. And some countries are actually saying that they have production capacity to produce more vaccines at scale. So COVAX is good, but it's not good enough. It's not sufficient. So this is an opportunity to really think about, reframing and rethinking the very notion of development assistance. And for Europe, which is one of Africa's collective European countries under the framework of the EU, they are one of Africa's largest bilateral aid partners. That maybe this is an opportunity to rethink development assistance around public health by, as Dr. John Nkengasong mentioned, already there are areas that have been outlined by the African Union in terms of how to organize the public health order in Africa. So how can Europe contribute to upgrading industrial capacity around pharmaceuticals in African countries? And there are hubs that exist, in South Africa, in Egypt, in Morocco, in Senegal, even in Nigeria, that are capable of, producing pharmaceuticals, helping with investing or supporting upstream research and development. Those are areas where, when we're rethinking public health in Africa, when we're rebuilding or building a new public health order in Africa, those are areas of support, not just necessarily providing donations to COVAX and waiting for months for it to deliver to the necessary countries. So I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Zainab. And your comments, your critique of the developmental model, which inspires COVAX, is very interesting. And I think the EU as well is trying to shift away from the sort of developmental model. And last year, just before the pandemic, unveiled a new partnership with Africa. And this was supposed to be discussed with the African Union leaders in 2020. And of course, the date has been postponed at this point indefinitely, as far as I know. It's maybe 2021 or maybe even 2022. So Sandra, I'd like to ask you, in light of this past year, is that strategy can will this pandemic year support it or push for a different type of partnership, or will it hinder?
Yeah, it's indeed, I think the goalposts are the same, but it's just that the starting line has gone back. I mean, as Zainab said, this could be, we're looking at almost like a lost decade in terms of very many factors of development. So that's very severe. But I think that when we proposed the communication that we did on the 9th of March 2020, it was very different. I think the global pandemic was declared 10 days after we put this on the table. And we proposed 5 partnerships together with Africa on green transition, on digital transformation, on the whole issue of job creation and private sector development. And in that same chapter, also a lot of focus on education and skills. And then there's a partnership on governance, peace, stability, as well as on migration and mobility. And that was the framework that we proposed. And that was, unfortunately, not discussed. Obviously, there's continuous outreach and there are many contacts going on, and many leaders in the European Union and leaders in the European Union institutions are constantly in touch with African counterparts. But you're right, Rosa, we didn't have the summit because it's very important, I think, for the leadership in the European Union that this is really a very important summit to take place physically, really to underline the importance that we attach, the strategic importance to this partnership. And as you will probably all agree, seeing each other on screen is very nice, but it's simply not the same. So what we're doing now is hopefully looking at a summit, which I, as you, do not know when that is going to take place. Probably end of the year, I suppose, I hope so, but it really depends on how this pandemic is developing. As you see, and as you said yourself, we have difficulties, of course, still in the European Union and also in Africa. And so we need to see when this can take place in a way that we can have that physically. So in the immediate term, I think what we're doing now is focusing essentially on 3 things. One is indeed the debt relief and the fiscal space. I think it's very important what Zainab has said. Mm-hmm. And that is through the G20 Paris, the debt service suspension initiative that you know, of which a lot of countries have already profited. But it's also to mobilize through the international finance institutions concessional financing. So that means cheaper or less risky financing. And it's also through the massive budget support that we do, because it is exactly that budget support which gives the governments who are in this fiscal crunch a bit of space. And then, of course, we leverage public and private sector funds. Because you know very well that the European Union is the largest development aid provider to the African continent, as well as the largest trading partner, largest foreign direct investment partner. But there's never enough funds in what we call development funds. Really, we will need private sector funds and private sector investment into Africa to really boost and recover quickly. Now, the second priority obviously is health. And we talked about COVAX, we talked about the vaccine sharing mechanism. And now we are looking into the longer term. And the longer term will definitely be about strengthening health systems, which was very well explained by John, and will look at the buildup of local manufacturing. And it's the places that Zainab pointed out, and I would want to add Kenya to that list, where there are indeed possibilities and where we will work together, and also to stronger pharmaceutical regulatory frameworks. So all that package is a priority that we are addressing now. And then I think last point of what we're doing now is to look at intra-Africa trade and continental trade. And there I'd like to mention the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is a flagship African initiative, which is very much supported by the European Union and which will be leading in the post-pandemic economic recovery. So those are the 3 points that we're focusing on right now, Rosa. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And some questions are coming in. And one of them, Sandra, you have already partially answered it. It's a question of if there are any EU-Africa partnerships, existing ones, with regard to pharmaceutical productions and medical early warning systems to build capacities and prevent future pandemics. And I'd like to ask perhaps John if he could address that. And then I'm just going through some of the questions. Also, another one, this perhaps is for you, Sandra, about how can the EU support capacity building in vaccine production in Africa? You've partially answered it, but perhaps you could say something more. And then, Zainab, I'd like to throw to you a more geopolitical question about geopolitical competition in Africa around vaccine procurement. What does it look like? Indeed, this is quite a big issue with the Chinese and the Russian vaccines. This is becoming an increasingly politicized tool. So we'd like to hear what it looks like from Africa. So shall we start with these 3 questions and then continue from there? So John, can I ask you to start perhaps to say something about cooperation between the Africa Union and the European Union and building up medical early warning systems and collaboration in the pharmaceutical industry?
No, thank you. The early warning and pharmaceutical, they go together. There are 3 things that guarantee the health security of a people. One is the ability of self-reliance for diagnostics. Second is self-reliance on vaccines. And third is self-reliance for therapeutics. In 1996, the drugs against HIV were developed, and with the so-called highly active antiretroviral treatment. And we immediately saw how Europe, the number of deaths in Europe and United States declined sharply. And I was in Cote d'Ivoire at that time as a mid-level public health officer. And it was regrettable that we waited for 10 years before those drugs were finally in Africa. And between 1996 and 2006, 12 million Africans died, and I'll add unnecessarily. And that I just wanted to use that point to underline my whole, the 3 underpinnings of a people's health security. So if you do not have those 3 things, then you really are a people that are naked. Okay, you are exposed, it will always happen, history will repeat itself over and over. Fast forward in 2009, the H1N1 pandemic occurred in the world. Vaccines will only arrive in developing world and Africa after the pandemic was over. Thank God the pandemic was not as severe as the one we are dealing with now. So here we are today. So I just wanted to use these points to highlight the fact that we must learn from history. If we do not learn from history as a continent, then we're bound to make the same mistakes. I think that is extremely important. Now, on the cooperation with Europe to strengthen defenses there, the instruments are already there. Okay, I look forward to the day that a partner's opening statement will be that we are going to work with Africa in the context of the Agenda 2063. I look forward to the day that a partner will start their statement by saying, I'm going to work with Africa in the context of their health strategy that is endorsed by the AU and spans from 2016 to 2030. I look forward to the day that partners will say, well, we're going to support Africa through Africa CDC because it is a mechanism, an instrument that has been put in place by the head of states of Africa as an early warning system for the continent, just as your European CDC is for the main. I look forward to that day that those the support is channeled through these mechanisms that are already there endorsed at the highest level of the continent. Then we begin to create what I call trusted partnerships, which by definition is partnership that aligns with our vision and not necessarily a partnership that comes in with already preconceived ideas and what we should do. I think Africa needs to be considered as an adult, which means that they know what they want. They have a lot of blueprints of what they want, and they have their capacity and capabilities of implementing what they want. What they don't have is the resources to do that. Okay, that shouldn't be confused by the lack of awareness and a strategic direction of what the continent and where the continent should be headed to. I really would like to see that people and our partners, when they engage us, they engage us within those frameworks there. I think with respect to manufacturing, on the 12th of April, we will be convening a meeting at the highest level of the continent, with the head of states, to really sit down and develop a blueprint on how do we manufacture vaccines, which Africa CDC is pushing for the political leadership. Everybody is invited. The Europeans have been invited. The Americans invited. We say, look, this is a vision that we want to move forward. We want to come out of that meeting with a partnership for vaccine manufacturing in Africa, where we define the how, the who, the what, and the when to do it so that we move from a theoretical conversation into practice. Vaccine manufacturing in Africa benefits the whole world. Okay, benefits exactly our immediate European partners. We import 99% of our vaccines. Okay, how can the security of a people be guaranteed where you import 99% of your vaccines? We have been testing for HIV for 40 years in the continent, and we do conduct about 150 million HIV tests a year, yet there's no single company in Africa that produces a simple rapid test for HIV. Okay, those are the kind of things that we need to really apply our minds to it and say, look, we can solve this, but we have to solve this in the context of a blueprint that is developed from the continent, owned by the continent. The continent, of course, must invest its own domestic financing resources into it, not just a concept of maybe we move with a ball in hand to get Europeans put money into it, Americans, and they do it for us. And lastly, let me just end by re-echoing what Zainab said, which she was extremely articulate with that the COVAX mechanism is excellent. I think it is a great symbol of cooperation, a great symbol of solidarity. But let's begin to graduate away from the instruments that were put in place about 70 years ago to govern health security. It is for our interest, if people listen to what we are saying, that we have to begin to regionalize some of these structures. Imagine for 1 second that we had COVAX, a part of the resources for COVAX went to Geneva, and part of it went to the regions, so that the regions can manage the resources, and you remove the burden from a highly centralized structure in Europe. That will be for the benefit for everybody. Okay, and think you have almost a federated system where you devolve a health security apparatus to the region with a global coordination from Geneva. There's nothing that the discussion or argument that says that when each time we think of these big initiatives, they must come out of Geneva. If you are thinking of the Global Fund, it has to be in Geneva. You think of Gavi, or it has to be in Geneva. You think of COVAX, it must be in Geneva. You think of the ACT Accelerator, it's almost like the world has been taking a position that says that the regions cannot think, and the region cannot manage their own health security apparatus there. It was true in the diagnostic landscape, it is true in vaccines, and it will be true for medicines if they become available. So I think it's a common reasoning that we should apply wisdom to what we are doing and say, look, when those instruments were put in place in 1947, the world was about 2.5 billion. Today, we are edging towards 8 billion people in the world. In the next 30 years, 1 in every 4 human beings on earth will be an African. So how can we continue to use highly centralized structures to guarantee our health security of the world? I think that will be a conversation that will be terribly win-win for everybody if we begin to reason that way.
Thank you very much. Sandra, can I also ask you this sort of, what can the EU do to support capacity building in vaccine production in Africa?
Yes, I'd be glad to. I mean, we've spoken about the health impact, and we've spoken about how incredibly long and steep the recovery will be, I think. I want to make just a few points. And the first is that, of course, always sound policies are at the basis of a sound recovery. So you can see that countries with diversified economies, countries that have value addition in their supply chain, countries that has sustainable debt situations, or the ones that have very conducive business and investment climates, they are the ones that will make a head start out of this recovery. And then the second is that we spoke a lot about the fiscal crunch and about the debt situation, etc. But I think we need to keep policy first in mind. And that is what President von der Leyen has done when she called for a global recovery initiative, where we actually connect debt relief with investing in sustainable development goals. Because we want to be, obviously, and we are a partner for Africa on recovery, but a green, inclusive and sustainable recovery. That is the most important. And I think the word partnership comes up all the time. And you may have noticed that the portfolio of my commissioner is now international partnerships, and I am in Directorate General for international partnerships. And I think that is a paradigm shift. And it goes very much in the way in which John said, you know, this is not about some donor recipient kind of thinking. We've left that behind. This is an equal partnership where we both look at the same challenges, because the SDGs are the same challenges. We all face that. We all are having to come out of this recovery and out of this crisis together. And for us, that would be based on sustainability, on environmental, social, political, multilateral sustainability, and really anchored in the values of democracy and human rights. That's how the European Union sees that partnership. And of course, we do that with Team Europe, as I said, with the member states of the European Union. Now, in manufacturing and in health systems, I already spoke about that a bit. We are looking into that. We are looking into partnerships with governments, but also private sector. And through our funds that we have available to, for example, make loans less risky and make private sector more susceptible to invest in these industries, we can help, hopefully, to jumpstart that. So we are looking at many ways to help. But one of the most important things is indeed the policies, the business climate, the investment climate, and for private sector to feel confident enough to actually go in and help. We are programming now the new budgetary period, 2021 to 2027. And this is very technical, but it is an opportunity for us to bring in that strengthening of health systems and that support to manufacturing in Africa. And that is what we're doing, Rosa.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I was planning to ask a question about the Green Deal and what it means for relations between Europe and Africa, but I think we're going to have to organise another event to talk about that because it's such a big topic. So let's just continue focusing on the pandemic, on the vaccines, and how geopolitics has started to use vaccine diplomacy. Weaponizing vaccines. And I'd like to ask Zainab to give us, what is the picture in Africa? How does it look from there? Are African states being courted by China and Russia and Europe for, to access to deliver the vaccine? How does it look there?
Yeah. So to address that question, I think I want to kind of reiterate the point that I made earlier and that, John also made, that, we are in a completely different environment right now, which is why we do need different approaches and different tools. We cannot use the same mechanisms that have been in existence for, 60, 70 years, set up after World War II to address challenges in an environment that is completely different right now. And what is this environment? When an environment of great power competition, which is increasingly, a lot of it is playing out in Asia, but it is also coming to Africa. And a lot of African countries have made it very clear that they do not want to choose, between either the US or China, or also the EU, actually, because they have relations with all of these, spheres of power or influence for various reasons. But it is still playing out. Like African countries are still kind of being dragged into this tussle. And unfortunately, this has then affected the ability to access vaccine supplies, right? So on one hand, you have, and to be frank, Western countries, as we discussed earlier, have imposed a lot of export restrictions on vaccine supplies. So over the weekend, I don't know if any of you saw this chart that made the rounds online showing different vaccine production by region of the world and the doses exported. So the first column is, China, which has produced, which has retained domestically 52% of its production, but has exported 48% of the vaccines. Then you have India, which has retained 56% of vaccines produced domestically, but has exported 44%, although that might even change very soon because India is also considering its own export restrictions to address a rising number of cases at home. And then you have the EU, which has retained 58% domestically, but exported 42%. The two that really stand out are the US and the UK, which have retained 100% of vaccines produced domestically. So you have this, these export restrictions, there's, what people call hoarding, but very, very importantly, as much as, you can even excuse, the export restrictions, because these are regions of the world that have suffered immensely in terms of the number of infections and the number of deaths, you can kind of excuse that. But then what really is quite baffling is that, in terms of allowing the scale up of production around the world, there are different parts of the world, not just India, but also Bangladesh, but also, even in African countries that can actually produce some of these vaccines. We've seen that it has been difficult to allow that to happen. These are the discussions going on right now at the World Trade Organization. Although, things are changing very, very rapidly by the minute. So we just learned that, over the weekend that the White House is considering actually supporting those proposals for IP waivers at the World Trade Organization. Hopefully that comes to pass. Also, increasingly in the EU, several member states, the parliaments in these countries are increasingly showing some inclination to support these IP waivers. So hopefully that happens. But this is the situation, that this vaccine nationalism has affected many developing countries, particularly those in Africa, the ability to access vaccines. But then on the other hand, you have, emerging powers, from China to Russia to India, but also, countries even like the UAE, which are using or providing vaccines to their, neighboring countries, to their allies in what has been called, quote unquote, vaccine diplomacy. Although, to be fair, everybody seems to be doing vaccine diplomacy in this era of, great power competition. And the problem also is with some of these vaccine diplomatic maneuvers, there isn't a lot of transparency. So you have a situation where countries like China and Russia that, you hear a lot of rhetoric of South-South solidarity from them, but at the same time, they're charging above market rates for the vaccines that they are supplying to some of these poor countries. So that also is a cause for concern. So this is really kind of the environment we find ourselves in, which is why then devoting the majority of resources to a great initiative like COVAX is just insufficient. It's good, but it's insufficient. And this is why we need to rethink and do things differently.
Thank you very much, Zainab. Well, I'm afraid we have to bring this conversation to an end, however much I'd like to continue talking with you.
I had a brief comment, please, just so that only the brilliant... Yeah, very 1 minute. I mean, the definition of vaccine diplomacy needs to be looked at in the context of whose diplomacy is it. the basic definition of diplomacy is that you look at you building relationship and friendships around. And I think that true friendship from where we sit in Africa is anyone who can help us get to 60% of our targets, which we have established as a continent, is going to be that person that meets our basic definition of a vaccine diplomacy. So if you come in and you give us just some 10,000 doses here, 2,000 doses there, and that is not the diplomacy that we need in this at this time here. And secondly, that it's okay to support COVAX, but it's also okay and very, very appropriately to support regional initiatives like the African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team, which is aiming to complement, to move the 20% that COVAX is guaranteeing to about 60% of our targets there. I think that to me would be the real definition of diplomacy, helping us, aligning with our vision and helping us to get to where we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also thank you for this thoughtful ending to what does vaccine diplomacy mean? Thank you all. I'd like to thank the speakers for joining me in this conversation today. I'd like to thank the audience for listening in and asking questions. And please also allow me to thank those you cannot see, my colleagues Alice, Indra, Francesco, who put together this event. There will be more. I hope to be able to work with Zainab so that we can focus on issues that are interesting both for the EU and for Africa. And thank you for participating. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.